In the suburbs of Chicago, Mike Gallagher, a seasoned detective, was widely respected for his dedication and professionalism. He had built a reputation within the police department for solving difficult cases and going the extra mile to ensure justice was served. However, this dedication came at a personal cost. Mike was often late coming home, spending long hours at the precinct, lost in the intricacies of criminal investigations. Over time, his work had become the center of his life, leaving little room for anything else. At home, Kate Gallagher, his wife of 15 years, felt the growing distance between them. Kate was a talented painter, known for her unique abstract works. In the early years of their marriage, Mike had been her biggest supporter. He had attended her art shows, offered feedback on her paintings, and encouraged her when she doubted herself. But those days seemed far away now. As Mike grew more absorbed in his career, Kate felt increasingly neglected. Kate's life had become routine and isolated. She spent most of her days in her home studio, working on her art. While her creative work had once been a source of joy and fulfillment, it now served as a distraction from the loneliness that crept into her life. The vibrant energy she had once poured into her paintings felt diminished, replaced by a sense of emptiness she struggled to shake off. The house they shared in a quiet neighborhood had become a place where Kate felt more alone than ever, despite Mike's physical presence. Kate tried to reach out to Mike several times, hoping to reconnect. She suggested they take a weekend trip together or even have dinner at their favorite restaurant downtown. But every attempt was met with a polite refusal. Mike would apologize, explaining that he was too busy with an ongoing investigation, and promised that things would get better soon. But they never did. As time went on, Kate stopped asking. The more Kate withdrew into her world of painting, the more she reflected on her life. She wondered how they had ended up here. She hadn't signed up for this life of silence and solitude. She remembered how supportive and caring Mike used to be, how their conversations would flow easily, and how they once dreamed of traveling the world together. Now those dreams felt like distant memories, buried under the weight of Mike's career and their increasingly disconnected lives. Kate's art became a reflection of her internal struggles. Her once bold and colorful canvases now featured muted tones and fragmented shapes. She spent hours trying to express the deep sadness she felt, but couldn't fully articulate. Art had always been her way of processing emotions, but now even that wasn't enough to fill the void in her heart. Her frustration grew as she realized that the person she needed to talk to, her husband, was the very person who seemed most unreachable. She was only in her mid-30s, with years of life ahead of her, yet she felt trapped in a situation where her needs and desires had been pushed aside. It was during one of these lonely evenings that Kate decided she needed a change. She resolved to participate in the upcoming local art exhibition. It had been a while since she'd publicly displayed her work, but she hoped that this event would help her reconnect with her passion and give her something to focus on besides her deteriorating marriage. She also hoped, though she wouldn't admit it out loud, that Mike would take notice, maybe even attend the exhibition, and that it might reignite some of the spark they had lost. But deep down, Kate knew that the exhibition was only a temporary distraction from the larger issues looming over her marriage. The void between her and Mike had grown too large to ignore. Still, she was determined to reclaim some part of herself, even if Mike remained distant. The exhibition was being held at a small gallery in downtown Chicago. It was well regarded among local artists, attracting both established and emerging talents. For Kate, it was an opportunity to immerse herself in a world she had once felt deeply connected to, a world she had slowly drifted away from as her relationship with Mike deteriorated. She spent the weeks leading up to the event in her studio, working tirelessly to prepare a series of new paintings. When the night of the exhibition finally arrived, Kate dressed with care, selecting a simple but elegant black dress that reflected the seriousness of her intent. She knew that Mike wouldn't be attending. He had already informed her that he was tied up with another investigation. But for once, she didn't let his absence dampen her spirits. The gallery was already buzzing with energy when she arrived. As she walked through the space, glancing at the works on display, Kate felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was during one of these moments that she met Luke Donovan, a neighbor she had only known in passing. Luke, who taught art at a nearby community college, had recently moved into the neighborhood with little fanfare. Kate had seen him once or twice before, but they had never exchanged more than a polite greeting. Tonight, however, Luke seemed genuinely interested in her work. He approached her as she stood near one of her paintings, a large abstract piece composed of dark, swirling colors that mirrored her internal struggles. "This is incredible," Luke said, his voice sincere. "The depth of emotion in this piece. It's like you've captured a storm inside." Kate smiled, slightly taken aback by the directness of his compliment. "Thank you," she replied, feeling a bit shy. "I've been working through some things lately, and I guess that came through in the painting." Luke nodded thoughtfully, his gaze still fixed on the canvas. "It's powerful," he said after a moment. "There's a vulnerability in it, but also a sense of strength. It's rare to see both in a single piece." The two of them began to talk more, and soon their conversation moved beyond the painting. Luke was charming, articulate, and easy to talk to. As an art professor, he was deeply familiar with the creative process, and he and Kate quickly found common ground in their shared passion for art. Throughout the evening, Luke remained by her side, offering insightful comments on her work and listening intently as she explained her process. He wasn't just being polite. His interest was genuine, and he seemed to understand the layers of meaning behind her paintings in a way that very few people did. As the night wore on, Kate realized how much she had missed this kind of intellectual and emotional connection. In Luke, she found someone who not only appreciated her work, but also seemed to see and understand her in a way that Mike no longer did. As the exhibition came to a close, Luke offered to walk Kate to her car. It was a simple gesture, but one that she hadn't expected. She accepted, and they strolled out of the gallery together into the cool Chicago evening. The conversation continued as they walked, moving from art to more personal topics. Luke spoke about his own struggles with balancing teaching and creating his own work. Kate found herself opening up about her frustrations with her marriage and her feelings of isolation. "I can relate," Luke said quietly after a pause. "It's hard when the person you care about isn't really there anymore, even if they're physically present." Kate nodded, surprised by how much his words resonated with her. She had been carrying the weight of her loneliness for so long, it felt almost natural. But now, standing next to Luke, she realized how much she craved this kind of connection. It wasn't just about art anymore. It was about being understood, being valued, and finding someone who made her feel alive again. By the time they reached her car, Kate knew that this was more than just a passing acquaintance. Luke had become more than just a neighbor or a fellow artist. He had become a friend. After their initial conversation at the exhibition, Kate and Luke began spending more time together. What had started as casual discussions about art soon blossomed into a deeper connection. Luke often invited her to the art studio at the community college where he taught, and Kate found herself eagerly accepting his offers. They would spend hours talking about technique, their creative processes, and the emotions that drove their work. It wasn't long before their discussions about art spilled over into more personal topics. Kate opened up to Luke in ways she hadn't with anyone else. She told him about her frustrations with Mike, about the loneliness that had become a constant presence in her life. Luke listened without judgment, offering empathy rather than solutions. He shared his own struggles, his failed relationships, his difficulties in balancing his passion for art with the demands of teaching. As they grew closer, Kate couldn't ignore the guilt that began to creep in. She knew her relationship with Luke was crossing boundaries that went beyond friendship. But at the same time, she couldn't pull herself away. Luke seemed to understand her in a way that Mike never could. He saw her not just as a wife or an artist, but as a complete person. Flawed, complex, and worthy of attention. In his presence, Kate felt valued, appreciated, and alive. The more time they spent together, the more Kate found herself thinking about Luke. She looked forward to their conversations, the way his eyes lit up when they talked about a particular painting or technique. She enjoyed the feeling of being seen, truly seen, by someone who seemed to care so deeply about her work and her well-being. And yet, every moment she spent with Luke made her feel more conflicted. She loved Mike. Or at least, she had once loved him. but she couldn't deny that her feelings for Luke were growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, after an especially long session in the studio, Luke suggested they take a walk by the lake. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the city. As they walked along the water, their conversation turned more introspective. Luke asked Kate about her dreams, what she wanted out of life, out of her art. Kate hesitated, unsure of how to answer. She hadn't thought about her dreams in a long time. Her life had become so centered around keeping things together with Mike, trying to make their marriage work, that her own desires had taken a back seat. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. "I used to have all these ideas about what my life would be. I wanted to travel, to show my art in galleries around the world. But now—" Luke stopped walking and turned to face her. "But now what?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. Kate met his gaze, feeling a lump form in her throat. "Now I just feel stuck," she said finally. "Like I'm living someone else's life, not the one I wanted for myself." Luke didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached out and gently touched her arm. The gesture was small, but it sent a wave of emotion through Kate. She had spent so long suppressing her feelings, pretending that everything was fine, that the simple act of someone offering comfort felt overwhelming. "You deserve to live the life you want," Luke said quietly. "You shouldn't have to settle for less." His words lingered in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Kate knew what he was really saying, and it terrified her. She also knew he was right. She had been settling for a life that made her feel invisible, for a marriage that no longer made her happy. The realization hit her with a force she wasn't prepared for. Without thinking, Kate closed the distance between them and kissed Luke. The kiss was hesitant at first, as if they were both testing the boundaries of what was happening. But it quickly deepened, fueled by the months of unspoken desire and emotional connection that had been building between them. Kate felt a rush of guilt even as she kissed him, but she couldn't stop. In that moment, it felt right. When they finally pulled away, both of them were breathless. Kate's heart raced as reality came crashing back. She had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The guilt surged through her, but so did a strange sense of relief. She had been denying her feelings for so long, pretending that she didn't want more from life, from love. Now, standing there with Luke, she felt something she hadn't felt in years: freedom. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. Was she sorry for kissing him? Or was she sorry for everything that had led up to this moment? Luke shook his head, his eyes searching hers. "Don't be," he said softly. "You don't have to be sorry." They stood in silence for a long moment, the gravity of what had just happened settling in. Kate knew that this kiss had changed everything. Mike Gallagher had always prided himself on his ability to read people. It was a skill that served him well as a detective in the Chicago Police Department, where the ability to pick up on subtle changes in behavior could mean the difference between solving a case and watching it go cold. Recently, however, he found himself applying that skill to someone much closer to home: his wife, Kate. For the past few weeks, Mike had noticed subtle but undeniable changes in Kate's behavior. She had become more distant, spending long hours in her studio, often without saying much when he came home from work. There was a time when she would greet him at the door, excited to share her latest project, or ask about his day. Now, their conversations had grown sparse, their interactions perfunctory. Mike knew that they had been drifting apart for some time, but the shift in Kate's demeanor felt more acute, more deliberate. Something was wrong. At first, Mike tried to ignore it. He told himself that they were just going through a rough patch, like all couples do. His job had always been demanding, and the recent uptick in crime meant he was spending even more time at the precinct. He reasoned that the long hours and late nights were taking a toll on their relationship, but it was nothing they couldn't work through. After all, they had been together for over a decade, weathering their fair share of ups and downs. But as the days passed, Mike's sense of unease grew. Kate was more withdrawn than he had ever seen her. She would often sit at the dinner table, staring off into the distance, her mind clearly elsewhere. When he asked her if something was wrong, she would brush it off with a vague smile and a quick excuse about being tired or stressed. But Mike's instincts told him that it was more than that. He had learned to trust those instincts over the years, and now they were screaming at him that something was off. One night, after another long shift, Mike came home to find Kate already asleep. He stood in the doorway of their bedroom for a moment, watching her. She looked peaceful, her hair spread across the pillow, but there was a tension in her expression even as she slept. Mike felt a pang of guilt. He knew that he hadn't been the best husband lately. The pressures of his job had consumed him, leaving little room for anything else. But this wasn't just about him. Something had changed in Kate, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it had nothing to do with his work schedule. In the following days, Mike began to pay closer attention. He watched Kate more carefully, looking for signs that might explain the distance between them. She still went to her studio, but now there were long stretches of time where he had no idea where she was or what she was doing. When he asked, she would simply say that she had been out running errands or meeting friends. But the explanations felt hollow. There was a secrecy to her movements that Mike couldn't ignore. His suspicions deepened when he noticed small details that didn't add up. Kate's phone, once left casually on the counter, was now always with her. She had become more guarded, more private. There were times when he would catch her quickly putting her phone away or closing her laptop when he entered the room. These actions were subtle, but to a trained detective like Mike, they stood out like red flags. Unable to shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, Mike's thoughts began to spiral. Was Kate having an affair? The idea seemed absurd at first. After all, they had built a life together. And despite their recent distance, Mike had always trusted her implicitly. But the nagging doubts in his mind wouldn't go away. He had seen it happen before, with friends and colleagues, people whose marriages seemed rock solid until they weren't. He couldn't help but wonder if the same thing was happening to him. It was during one of these moments of doubt that Mike decided to take matters into his own hands. If Kate wasn't going to tell him what was going on, he would find out himself. His job had taught him how to be discreet, how to gather information without raising suspicion. He told himself that this wasn't about mistrust. It was about protecting their marriage. He needed to know the truth, whatever it was. Over the next few days, Mike began quietly monitoring Kate's movements. He started small, checking her phone when she wasn't around. But she had set a new passcode, something she had never done before. That only heightened his suspicions. So, he escalated. He began following her on the days he wasn't working, staying just far enough behind to avoid being seen. He felt a strange mix of guilt and determination, knowing that what he was doing was an invasion of her privacy, but also convinced that it was the only way to get to the bottom of whatever was happening. It didn't take long for Mike to uncover the truth. One afternoon, he followed Kate as she left the house, her bag slung over her shoulder. She walked with purpose, not towards her studio, but in the opposite direction, towards a neighborhood that Mike recognized immediately. She was heading to Luke Donovan's house, their neighbor and the art professor she had met at the gallery exhibition. Mike's heart sank as he watched her approach Luke's door and knock. Within moments, Luke opened the door, and the two of them greeted each other warmly. Too warmly. Mike's stomach twisted as he watched Kate step inside, the door closing behind her. He stayed outside for what felt like hours, his mind racing with the implications of what he had just witnessed. He didn't need to see more to know what was happening. The signs had been there all along, but now he had the confirmation he dreaded. But Mike was a detective, and he knew he couldn't ignore the truth forever. The more he watched Kate, the clearer it became that her relationship with Luke wasn't just a fleeting distraction. It was something more. He saw the way she smiled when she talked to Luke, the way her entire demeanor changed when they were together. It was a side of her that Mike hadn't seen in years, a side that used to be reserved for him. Finally, Mike knew that he couldn't keep silent any longer. He needed to confront Kate, to hear her side of the story. But deep down, he already knew what she would say. The truth was, staring him in the face, and there was no escaping it. It was a quiet Wednesday evening. the kind that Mike Gallagher usually spent at the station or chasing down leads in some case. But that night, something pulled him home earlier than usual. He told himself it was because he wanted to see Kate, maybe try to have the conversation they'd been avoiding for weeks. He could sense the distance between them widening by the day, and though part of him wanted to confront her about Luke, the other part still hoped that he was wrong, that there was an innocent explanation for everything. When he pulled into the driveway, the house was dark. Kate's car was gone. Mike's heart sank, but he told himself she had probably gone out for groceries or was visiting a friend. But a gnawing suspicion clawed at him. He hadn't seen her car at the grocery store. His instincts, the same ones that had served him so well in his years as a detective, screamed at him that something was wrong. He entered the house, tossed his keys on the kitchen counter, and stood for a moment in the silence. Normally, the empty house would feel like a refuge after a long day, but tonight it felt suffocating. He moved through the rooms, calling out her name, but there was no response. The familiar sense of dread returned, stronger now, and Mike knew exactly where Kate was. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and headed back outside, his footsteps quickening as he made his way across the street to Luke Donovan's house. He didn't bother trying to calm himself down. The anger that had been simmering for weeks now bubbled to the surface, fueled by every late-night suspicion, every guarded look from Kate, and every quiet exchange she had shared with Luke. As Mike approached Luke's house, his worst fears were confirmed. Through the front window he saw them, Kate and Luke, together. She was in his arms, her head resting on his chest, and Luke was holding her as if he had every right to. For a brief moment, Mike froze, staring at the scene in disbelief. The logical part of his brain, the one trained to analyze facts and make rational decisions, urged him to turn around, go home, and confront Kate later. But the other part, the part overwhelmed by hurt, betrayal, and anger, took over. His vision blurred with rage, and before he knew what he was doing, Mike was at the door, pounding on it with enough force to shake the frame. The door swung open, and Luke stood there, his face a mixture of shock and confusion. Behind him, Kate gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. But Mike didn't register any of it. All he saw was the man who had stolen his wife, the man who had destroyed everything. Without a word, Mike shoved past Luke, storming into the living room, fists clenched at his sides. "Mike, wait." Kate started, her voice trembling, but he barely heard her. His entire body was consumed with a white-hot fury that blocked out everything else. Luke tried to reason with him, hands raised in a defensive posture. "Mike, this isn't what it looks like. Let's just talk, okay?" But there was no talking anymore. Mike's world had shattered, and in that moment, he didn't care about reason. His mind flashed to every case he'd worked, every instance of betrayal and violence, and now he was living it. He lunged at Luke without thinking, his fists landing blow after blow. The first punch knocked Luke off balance, and he fell backward, crashing into the coffee table. Kate screamed, but Mike didn't stop. All the hurt and frustration that had been building inside him for weeks poured out in a torrent of violence. Luke tried to defend himself, but Mike was stronger, fueled by a rage that seemed limitless. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. Each punch felt like a release, a way to reclaim control over a life that had spiraled beyond his grasp. In the chaos, Mike barely noticed when Luke stopped moving. His body went limp, blood pooling beneath him from a gash on his head where it had struck the corner of the table. Mike stood over him, chest heaving, his fist stained with blood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. It was only then that the enormity of what he had done began to sink in. The fog of rage lifted, replaced by cold, stark reality. Luke lay motionless at his feet, and Kate stood frozen in the corner of the room, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. "Oh my God!" Kate's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "What have you done?" Mike took a step back, his hands trembling. The adrenaline that had carried him through the attack drained from his body, leaving him numb and lightheaded. He stared down at Luke's lifeless body, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. One moment, he had been blinded by fury, and now, everything was different. Everything was over, his career, his marriage, his entire life. All of it had been destroyed in a single uncontrollable moment of violence. Mike's heart pounded in his chest, the gravity of his actions sinking in deeper with each passing second. Kate moved slowly toward him, her hands shaking. We have to call someone. We have to. Her voice faltered as she looked at Luke's body, her eyes welling with tears. Mike couldn't look at her. He couldn't face her or what he had done. The weight of it was too much, and for the first time in his life he had no idea what to do next. The man who always had a plan, always knew how to navigate the darkest corners of the human experience, was now utterly lost. "We can't call anyone," Mike finally muttered, his voice hoarse. "If we call the cops, if they find out—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. His career was over. He would be tried for murder. Everything he had worked for, everything he had built, would be taken away in an instant. Kate shook her head, her tears falling freely now. "Mike, we have to. We can't just leave him here. You killed him." Her words hit him like a sledgehammer. "You killed him." Mike stared down at Luke's body, the finality of those words sinking in. There was no undoing this, no going back. What was done, was done. "I didn't mean to," Mike whispered, more to himself than to Kate. I didn't mean for this to happen." But it didn't matter what he meant. The reality was right in front of him. Luke was dead, and Mike was responsible. Kate took a step closer, her voice trembling. "What do we do, Mike? What do we do?" Mike didn't have an answer. For the first time in his life, he was standing on the edge of a cliff, with nothing but darkness below. In the hours following Luke Donovan's death, the Gallagher household was consumed by a suffocating silence. Mike and Kate sat in the living room, both too shaken to speak, the weight of what had transpired crushing them under its relentless pressure. The body of their neighbor, Luke, lay lifeless just a few feet away, a brutal reminder of Mike's irreversible actions. Mike stared at his bloodied hands, his mind numb. The reality of his situation hit him with the force of a freight train. There was no escaping this. He could feel the walls of his life closing in around him, and the question that loomed large now wasn't whether he could escape, but how long he could delay the inevitable. Kate, trembling, sat across from him, her face streaked with tears. "We need to do something, Mike," Kate whispered. Her voice cracked under the strain of the situation, each word trembling with fear. "We can't just sit here." Mike clenched his fists, still stained with the evidence of his crime. "I know," he muttered, barely audible. But the truth was, he didn't know what to do. His instincts as a detective told him to hide, to cover his tracks, and protect himself. But his conscience told him otherwise. "We need to call someone," Kate said again, louder this time. "We can't handle this on our own. We need help." In that moment, she knew exactly who they needed to call. Anna Harris, Kate's old friend, and an experienced defense attorney. Anna had been a source of strength for Kate during some of her most difficult times, and now, more than ever, Kate needed her. Without another word, Kate picked up her phone and dialed Anna's number. Mike said nothing as she made the call. He knew that this was out of his hands now. He had lost control the moment his fist connected with Luke's skull, and now there was no turning back. Anna arrived at the house less than an hour later, her face a mask of professionalism, though her eyes betrayed a deep concern. She had known Kate and Mike for years, but seeing them like this, shaken, terrified, and on the verge of collapse, was something she hadn't expected. "Tell me everything," Anna said calmly as she entered the room. She glanced at Luke's body but made no move toward it. Her focus was entirely on Mike and Kate, who looked like they were drowning. Kate spoke first, her voice choked with emotion as she recounted the events of the evening. Mike remained silent, his head in his hands, as Kate explained how things had spiraled out of control, how Mike had lost his temper and killed Luke in a fit of rage. When Kate finished, Anna sighed deeply, rubbing her temples. "This is serious, Kate. Mike, you understand what this means, don't you? Mike finally looked up, his face pale and expressionless. "I know," he said, his voice hollow. "I killed him. There's no getting around that." Anna nodded. "You're right. There isn't. The police will investigate this thoroughly, and given your background as a detective, they'll scrutinize every detail. You can't run from this." Kate wiped away a tear. "What do we do now, Anna? What's our next step?" Anna paused, considering her words carefully. "The best course of action is to cooperate fully. If you try to hide this, it will only make things worse. You need to report the incident to the police, explain what happened, and hope for some leniency. Mike, you'll need to turn yourself in." Mike's heart sank at her words. He had known, deep down, that this was his only option, but hearing it from Anna made it real. There was no escaping what he had done. He had killed a man, and now he would have to face the consequences. "But what about Kate?" Mike asked, his voice tight with fear. "She didn't do anything. She shouldn't have to suffer because of me." Anna looked at Kate, and then back at Mike. "Kate will need to give her statement. But as long as she cooperates, she won't be held accountable. This is on you, Mike." The next few hours passed in a blur. Anna guided them through the process of contacting the police, and soon enough, the authorities were at the door. Mike stood there, hollowed out and numb, as he was handcuffed and led to the squad car. Kate watched from the doorway, her body trembling, tears streaming down her face, as the man she had once loved so deeply was taken away to face justice. The trial that followed was grueling. The prosecution painted Mike as a man who had allowed his emotions to get the better of him, a man who had brutally killed his neighbor in a fit of jealous rage. They brought in witnesses to testify to the strained relationship between Mike and Kate, and the growing closeness between Kate and Luke. Though Mike's reputation as a respected detective carried some weight, it was clear that the evidence against him was overwhelming. Kate was called to the stand, her testimony difficult but necessary. She recounted the months leading up to the incident, the emotional distance between her and Mike, and how she had sought solace in her friendship with Luke. But she was careful to avoid blaming Mike entirely, acknowledging that their relationship had been troubled long before Luke entered the picture. Throughout the trial, Anna fought tirelessly to present Mike's case in the best possible light. She argued that while Mike had acted out of rage, it was not premeditated, and that he deeply regretted his actions. She emphasized his years of service as a detective, his dedication to the community, and his clean record. But even Anna knew that it was an uphill battle. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and cross-examinations, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty of manslaughter. It wasn't the worst outcome, but it wasn't the best either. The court recognized that Mike hadn't planned the murder, but his inability to control his rage had resulted in the death of another person, and there were consequences for that. In the end, Mike was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Kate, standing in the back of the courtroom, wept silently as the sentence was read. The man she had once known, the man who had dedicated his life to justice, was now a convicted criminal, his future irrevocably altered by one fateful decision.